Miss Marple notices a strange perfume lingering in a room where no visitor was ever announced. The misplaced scent leads her to uncover a web of jealousy, betrayal, and a stolen identity. As the truth unravels, she realizes the fragrance hides the key to a shocking murder. Chapter 1. The Garden Party in the village of Woodla Common, where time passed gently and gossip moved quicker than the post. The annual summer charity garden party was an event of near religious importance. The vicarage lawn had been groomed to perfection, its emerald grass trimmed like a gentleman's collar. White linen-covered tables stood neatly in rows, bearing teapots, sponge cakes, buttered scones, and delicate cups that clinked lightly in the breeze like porcelain applause. Above them swayed paper lanterns, gently tossing in rhythm with the wind, casting soft shadows over the elderly and the elegant alike. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair beneath the largest of the parasols, wearing her pale blue cardigan and a straw hat decorated with forget-me-nots. To any passerby, she looked like just another sweet old lady, quietly enjoying her tea and seed cake. But her soft blue eyes, though framed by age, missed nothing, not the way Mrs. Halberton refilled her own teacup before anyone else's, nor how the vicar's niece, Daisy, kept glancing nervously toward the hedge maze that bordered the lawn. She noticed, too, that Reverend Littleshaw was not quite himself this year, his smile strained, his laughter a bit hollow, his usual warmth clouded by some internal fog. As the raffle tickets were being passed around in a tin biscuit box, Miss Marple listened to the hum of polite conversation, but her mind was elsewhere. She had lived too long and seen too much to believe in the illusion of peaceful villages. Woodla Common, for all its trimmed hedges and clean curtains, was like every other place on earth, full of secrets, bruised egos, and past sins folded neatly behind lace doilies. That's what made the event so fascinating. The party was more than a social gathering, it was a stage, and everyone was performing. At the center of today's excitement was a newcomer, Miss Celeste Daubry, a striking woman in her 40s. Celeste had recently moved into the old Wentworth cottage, the ivy-covered house, that had stood vacant for nearly a year. She brought with her an air of mystery, a faint French accent, and the kind of perfume that made heads turn before she even entered a room. She claimed to be retired from the stage, though no one could say what productions she'd starred in, or even where. Her presence had stirred up speculation like a spoon in a teacup. Was she a widow? An heiress? A woman on the run? No one knew, and that only made her more fascinating. Today, Celeste wore a cream dress with a crimson sash and a matching rose tucked behind one ear. She laughed often, touched arms lightly when she spoke, and flattered even the dullest villagers into blushing. She had, without doubt, become the main character of this year's party, even eclipsing Pamela Halberton, who had coordinated the entire event and was now visibly trying to reclaim the spotlight by being everywhere and helpful to everyone. Just as the raffle was about to begin, with Reverend Littleshaw clearing his throat for the 5th time, a loud and piercing scream shattered the delicate harmony of teacups and birdsong. It came from the far end of the vicarage garden, just beyond the high privet hedge where children had been told not to wander. Guests turned in alarm, rising from their seats, some clutching their hats, others spilling tea in their haste. From behind the hedge, Daisy Fullerton stumbled out, her white dress stained with green grass and her hands trembling uncontrollably. "There's someone," she stammered. "She's not moving. There's blood." Chaos erupted. Women gasped and clutched pearls, men exchanged looks of alarm, and the vicar, pale as communion linen, asked for someone to phone the constable. Pamela Halberton ushered Daisy away, wrapping her in a shawl and whispering soothing nonsense. A few brave souls made their way through the hedge only to return moments later. White-faced and silent, "It's Miss Daubry," someone said, voice shaking. "She's dead. The words rippled through the gathering like a poison breeze. Death had no place at garden parties, not here, not in Woodley Common, where the worst scandal last year had been about someone putting gin in the elderflower cordial. Miss Marple stood slowly, her face a picture of quiet concern, though inside her mind had already begun to work like a well-wound clock. She moved gently through the stunned crowd, murmuring pleasantries, touching shoulders lightly as she passed, as if to calm everyone else more than herself. When she reached the hedge, she stood back, allowing the others to crowd forward. Celeste Daubry lay in the grass, her body unnaturally still. Her elegant dress was bunched beneath her, her right hand extended toward a broken teacup, as though she had dropped it just before falling. Her face was pale, but not peaceful. There was something strained in the angle of her mouth, something wrong in the way her fingers curled. Around her neck, a thin line of bruising was just visible beneath the collar of her dress. Her rose had fallen, crushed, beside her head. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the faint scent that lingered in the air. Not Celeste's usual fragrance, an expensive floral blend with undertones of jasmine and something musky. No, this was different, sharper, a powdery sweetness she knew well from her younger days, worn by a very different sort of woman, and it was too strong to be accidental. Funny, Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular. That's not her perfume at all. Someone called for a doctor, someone else for the police. Guests huddled in tight knots, whispering madly. Already, theories began to form. A heart attack, perhaps, or sunstroke, or a tragic fainting spell on account of excitement. After all, Celeste was dramatic, wasn't she? Miss Marple said nothing more, but her eyes drifted from face to face: the trembling Daisy, the tightly composed Mrs. Halberton, the vicar with hands clasped in prayer, and even the quiet young man who had come to the party alone and stayed close to the lemonade table. She had a feeling this was only the beginning, and in her experience, once murder introduced itself to a village, especially during something as civilized as a garden party, it never came alone. Chapter 2. The village reacts. Woodley Common was not a village that welcomed disorder. It liked its routines neat, its secrets buried deep beneath smiles, and its tragedies served with tea and minimal fuss. But by the evening of the garden party, as news of Celeste Daubry's death spread like spilled ink on linen, the village found itself thrown into a state of quiet hysteria, polished, polite, and teetering on the edge of scandal. By dusk, the vicarage was cordoned off by a rope no thicker than a clothesline, manned by Constable Dewhurst, a broad-shouldered, good-natured man with a fondness for boiled sweets and a tragic inexperience with actual crime. He stood near the gate, looking visibly overwhelmed, occasionally scribbling notes in a pad far too clean for a murder scene. The doctor had come and gone, muttering something about asphyxiation, but that hadn't stopped half the village from forming their own conclusions before supper. At the heart of the village, the Lamb and Flag public house was unusually full for a Sunday night. Locals gathered in small clusters, nursing their pints and dropping their voices as they leaned closer. "She always did wear too much perfume," muttered Mrs. Simmons, the butcher's wife, the kind of woman who liked attention. "Mark my words, this was jealousy. I heard she was carrying on with the vicar," whispered Ned Granger, whose garden gnomes were painted with frightening precision. "Saw them walking together by the canal just last week." "Oh, don't be stupid, Ned," his wife hissed. "The woman was murdered. That's not the vicar's style. I think it was that Pamela Halberton. Did you see her face when Celeste arrived in that silk dress? Murderous, all across the village, curtains twitched, telephones buzzed. Teacups were filled again and again as households replayed the same questions with different names. Who would want to kill Celeste Daubry? And why at the vicar's garden party, in broad daylight, with half the village within shouting distance? At her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat quietly knitting. She wasn't talking, not yet. Her method was always the same: listen, observe, and wait. She had already heard 3 wildly different theories during her short walk home. One involved poison. Another claimed it was a revenge plot by a jealous lover from France. And a third, courtesy of the grocer's apprentice, suggested Celeste had been a spy during the war, and someone had finally gotten her. Miss Marple preferred facts to fantasies. What she found most interesting wasn't the death itself, but the reactions to it. Human nature, as she often said, rarely changed. People might wear hats or cut their cucumbers differently in different decades, but jealousy, fear, guilt, and pride they endured. And it was in how people spoke, what they avoided, and how they positioned themselves afterward that the truth usually lay by morning. The police had officially ruled Celeste's death suspicious. Chief Inspector Cryptic was called from the county, a man Miss Marple had worked with before, though she'd never used the word worked. He had a quiet respect for her insights, though it annoyed him how often her soft observations made his deductions seem blunt. Cryptic arrived just after 10, wearing a gray suit and an expression like he'd bitten into something sour. He stepped into the vicarage garden with a notebook in one hand and a half-remembered respect for small-town hospitality in the other. Miss Marple was already there, seated near the flower beds, seemingly absorbed in her embroidery. She looked up with a polite smile. "Chief Inspector," she said gently, "I'm so very sorry we have to meet under such unfortunate circumstances, though one does suppose it was inevitable. Sooner or later, something wicked always turns up in even the most charming places." Cryptic gave a weary smile. "Miss Marple, I had a feeling you'd be nearby, just observing," she said modestly. The inspector looked out over the now empty garden, the scene of such calm only 24 hours ago. Strangled, they say. Barely visible marks. No sign of struggle. Not a soul saw a thing. You wouldn't think it possible in such a crowded garden. But of course, Miss Marple replied, threading her needle. Everyone was terribly distracted. The raffle, the scones. Mr. Tilling's dog broke free from its leash and made quite a scene by the trestle table. Didn't it? Cryptic blinked. "I didn't hear about that." "Oh yes," Miss Marple said. A great many eyes were turned away from the hedge at precisely the moment they should have been looking. It was most convenient. Cryptic's brows furrowed. Convenient for who? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She rarely did. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Halberton yet?" Cryptic frowned. She gave a brief statement. Seemed shocked, but very helpful. "She's always very helpful," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Though I do wonder why she was the first to touch the girl after she screamed, before anyone knew what had happened. It's a dangerous thing, you know, tampering with a body." Cryptic scribbled something into his notebook, more out of reflex than understanding. "I'll have another word with her." As he walked away, Miss Marple returned to her embroidery. But her mind ticked away like a grandfather clock. Already, she'd begun her list of suspects, not just those who might have hated Celeste Daubry, but those whose behavior shifted after the event. People tried to hide guilt, yes, but more often they betrayed themselves with fear. And that perfume, that was the thread, not hers, worn by someone else, someone who had been closer than anyone realized. Chapter 3. Early investigation. Morning after Celeste Daubry's murder dawned with an unsettling stillness over Woodley Common. The village, usually alive with the gentle rustle of newspapers, the creak of bicycle wheels, and the clatter of milk bottles, seemed to hold its breath. Even the birdsong felt more tentative, as though nature itself was pausing in respect or suspicion. Chief Inspector Cryptic had taken up temporary station in the vicarage's study, which now served as a makeshift command center. He was doing his best to establish facts, but the facts, as they stood, were like pebbles scattered across a river, visible, but offering no clear path forward. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had resumed her daily routines on the surface. She took her morning walk to the grocer's, stopped at the post office, and watered the pink geraniums on her window ledge. But in truth, every step, every word exchanged, was part of her investigation. She didn't need a warrant or a uniform. She needed only the quiet confidence of an old woman who had lived long enough to understand the truths that people tried to hide. As she walked through the village, she made careful mental notes. Daisy Fullerton, the vicar's niece, hadn't left the house since the party. Mrs. Halberton had already been seen delivering baked goods to the constable's wife Anne. Miss Marple suspected was less about kindness and more about steering opinion. And Mr. Edmund Lee, the quiet man who had lingered near the lemonade table during the garden party, now seemed to be taking longer, more winding routes to the post office, as if avoiding the main road. Back at the vicarage, Cryptic sat with Constable Dewhurst going over the guest list for the party. 47 people. And yet, somehow, not a single one had seen Celeste collapse, or scream, or even argue with anyone. They were all enjoying the scones, talking about roses, watching the raffle. It was infuriatingly British. Everyone remembered the jam flavor, but no one remembered the murder. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage mid-morning, under the polite pretense of delivering a jar of homemade marmalade. Reverend Littleshaw invited her, and gratefully he had always found her presence oddly calming. Like the ticking of a steady clock in a storm, she was sitting just there. "You know," the vicar said, pointing to a wicker chair near the hydrangeas, laughing about something Mrs. Grafton said. "And then gone. Just gone. She had a presence, didn't she?" Miss Marple murmured. The vicar nodded. "Too much, perhaps. Not that I'm saying, well, you understand." Miss Marple nodded back. She did understand. Villages didn't always welcome flamboyant strangers, especially not ones who drew attention. And Celeste had drawn more than her share in just a few weeks. Later that day, Cryptic met with the key guests individually at the village hall. Pamela Halberton was the first to arrive, dressed all in somber gray, her tone crisp and helpful. "I hardly knew the woman," she said, folding her hands primly in her lap. "She came out of nowhere, you know. Claimed she was retired from the stage, but really, who could tell? She seemed slippery." "Did you see her arguing with anyone at the party?" Cryptic asked. Pamela hesitated. "Not exactly arguing, no. But she had a way of making you feel you'd said something wrong, even when you hadn't. I did notice her speaking to young Mr. Lee, quite closely. He's a shy one, very private. I'd be surprised if he even knew how to flirt." "Did she seem distressed before the incident?" "Not at all. If anything, she seemed pleased with herself. Gave me a look like she'd just heard a secret." Cryptic noted that. But it was Miss Marple who quietly slipped into the back of the room and studied Pamela's posture. Her polished shoes, the tension in her shoulders when Celeste's name came up. Pamela was used to control, but something about Celeste had clearly unnerved her. Next came Edmund Lee, the man who kept to himself, rented a small flat behind the old bookshop, and rarely spoke to anyone unless necessary. He was soft-spoken and polite, but evasive when asked about his interaction with Celeste. "She said she recognized me," he murmured, "from London. But I've never lived there. I told her so." "Did she insist?" Cryptic asked. "No. But she gave me a look, as if she knew something about me I didn't want known." Miss Marple's ears perked at that. Secrets, always the key. Daisy Fullerton, still shaken, could barely speak during her interview. She only repeated what she'd said before that. She'd wandered behind the hedge, looking for a quiet place to sit when she stumbled upon Celeste's body. "I didn't touch anything," she whispered. "I ran back as soon as I saw her." "Why did you go behind the hedge at all?" Cryptic asked gently. Daisy looked down at her hands. I just needed air. It was crowded, noisy, Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, thinking. Everyone had an excuse. Everyone had an alibi of sorts. But the details didn't fit. Not yet, not the perfume, not Celeste's last smile, not Pamela's controlled rage, and certainly not Edmund's quiet terror. She reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a small notebook, one she kept for such occasions. She wrote for names in tidy script. 1. Pamela Halberton, jealousy, social control, threatened. 2. Edmund Lee, recognized, shame, fear. 3. Daisy Fullerton, innocent, or hiding something deeper. For unknown, the perfume. It belonged to someone, not Celeste. She underlined the last note twice. Then she turned out the light and let the village settle back into silence, knowing the storm had only just begun. Chapter 4. First suspects. 2 days after the garden party, Woodloch Common had transformed from a picturesque village into a quiet theater of suspicion. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar now avoided each other's gaze. Church pews felt colder. Conversations trailed off when footsteps approached. The air carried the subtle tension of a place trying not to admit that something dark had entered, and refused to leave. Chief Inspector Cryptic, while calm in appearance, was growing increasingly frustrated. He had run through timelines, confirmed Celeste's movements, spoken to nearly every person at the garden party, and yet nothing pointed definitively to any one person. No motive stood out strong enough, no opportunity precise enough. But villagers weren't patient people when scandal hovered near. They needed someone to blame, and someone soon. That morning, a piece of news made its way through the village like a spark through dry brush. Celeste's room had been searched, not officially, but quietly by Cryptic's order. What they found wasn't shocking, but it was suggestive. Her vanity table was cluttered with letters, some from men, some unsigned, and one that read only, "You can't pretend forever. People remember." But what truly caught the inspector's attention was the perfume bottles. Celeste, it appeared, had several, yet none matched the scent that lingered on her dress the day of the murder. The jasmine-heavy blend she was known for wasn't what hung in the air when she died. That confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. She wasn't wearing her perfume, Cryptic told her as they walked slowly along the green. So either someone else was close enough to leave their scent on her, or she'd handled someone else's bottle. Miss Marple nodded, her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap as she sat on the wooden bench, overlooking the village square. "People don't often change perfumes," she said. "Not without reason, and certainly not at a public event where first impressions matter." Cryptic exhaled. "You think it was a woman, then?" "I think the scent was a message," she replied quietly. "A careless man might spill it, but only a woman would apply it with enough intention to leave a mark." The first suspect was formalized that afternoon, Mrs. Pamela Halberton. The motive, the inspector reasoned, was emotional. Celeste had quickly drawn the attention of the village, especially the men Reverend Littleshaw, the grocer's eldest son, and even Pamela's husband, whom she caught speaking rather too long with Celeste outside the library one Tuesday morning. A jealous, proud woman combined with an overpowering personality made for tension. And Pamela had, notably, been the first to approach the body under the guise of comforting Daisy. Perhaps she tampered with the scene, Cryptic theorized, or even planted something. Miss Marple said nothing, but inwardly disagreed. Pamela was many things: sharp-tongued, competitive, desperate for control, but she was not impulsive. If she had wanted to kill, she would not have done it during a garden party in full view of her social world, and certainly not without ensuring it was cleaner. Pamela, of course, denied everything. "Inspector," she said coolly in her sitting room, arms folded over a mauve shawl, "if I had wanted to humiliate Miss Dawbrey, I could have done it far more effectively with words than strangulation." "And the perfume?" Cryptic asked. Pamela narrowed her eyes. "I wear lavender and rosewater. Ask my husband." Miss Marple believed her, or at least believed she wasn't the killer. She filed Pamela under possible accomplice or red herring, but not a murderer. Then came the second suspect, Mr. Edmund Lee. Edmund had grown visibly more anxious since the murder. He'd been seen pacing the lane behind the post office, declining social invitations rare as they were, and twice had left the baker's shop without buying anything. When he was called back for further questioning, he arrived looking worn and pale, his collar slightly askew, his fingers trembling. "You told us she thought she recognized you," Cryptic said. "Why lie about that?" "I didn't lie," Edmund replied, eyes darting toward the window. I didn't know her. At least, I didn't remember her. Until I saw that letter." Cryptic leaned forward. "You wrote her one?" "No," Edmund said, then hesitated. "But I think she knew something about me, about my time in Brighton. I had a difficult situation. A girl, it ended badly. She was involved, tangentially. I'm not proud of who I was then. You were being blackmailed." "No," Edmund whispered. "Worse, I think she pitied me. For some men, pity was more damning than any accusation." Cryptic left the interview unconvinced. There was something in Edmund that didn't add up, but again, no concrete link, no motive clear enough, no confession. Miss Marple was, as usual, more focused on what wasn't said. "He's afraid," she told Cryptic later, "but not of the murder, of being seen." Seen for what? For the man he used to be. That evening, something curious happened. A letter arrived at the police station, anonymously, clumsily printed, the ink smudged. No return address. It read, "Check the perfume counter at Avery's chemist. Ask who bought mimosa." Cryptic was puzzled. Miss Marple smiled softly when he showed her. "Mimosa," she said. "Now that is interesting. You recognize it?" "Oh yes," she said. "It was very popular in 1938. A light, floral scent, sharp, unmistakable. Very few women wear it now, and you think it was the scent on Celeste." "I'm quite sure it was, but I also know who used to wear it in this village. Years ago." Cryptic's pen stopped. "Who?" Miss Marple's smile didn't fade, but her voice dropped a note. "Mrs. Ruth Smedley." Cryptic looked blank. "Who?" Miss Marple turned toward the window, where the sun was dipping low behind the steeple. "She moved away 8 years ago," she said. "But she's back now, quietly, staying with her sister. Changed her name, I believe. And she was at the garden party." Cryptic's eyes widened. Why didn't she appear on the guest list? Miss Marple gave him a gentle, pitying look. "Because no one invited her." Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Next morning brought with it a chilly breeze that rustled through Woodley Common as if nature itself was sifting through lies. Though the sun shone faintly through a veil of mist, there was no warmth in the air, just unease. At 9:30 sharp, Miss Marple stood at the door of Avery's chemist as it opened for the day. The little bell above the door gave a cheerful chime that clashed starkly with the reason for her visit. The interior, with its neat shelves of lotions, bandages, and smelling salts, smelled faintly of eucalyptus and chalk. Mr. Avery himself, a balding man in a brown cardigan and thick spectacles, looked up from behind the counter with a start. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I'm terribly sorry to trouble you." "Mr. Avery," she said sweetly, "but I'm trying to recall something, and I thought you might help me." She glanced around and lowered her voice. "Do you happen to recall selling a bottle of mimosa perfume in the last fortnight?" Mr. Avery's eyebrows rose. "Mimosa? My word, that's a name I haven't heard in some time. I keep a few of the old blends, of course, for the ladies who are particular about their preferences. Let me see." He disappeared into the back room, and after a short moment, returned with a thick, cloth-bound ledger. "Yes," he said, tapping a name. "Just one bottle sold this month, 5 days before the garden party. To whom, if I may ask?" Mr. Avery adjusted his glasses and squinted. Mrs. Ruth Smedley, paid in cash, said it was a gift for her sister, I believe. Miss Marple smiled politely, but inside her mind was already moving. Ruth Smedley, once a midwife in the village, known for her sharp tongue and ability to hold a grudge like a dog with a bone. She had vanished nearly a decade ago after a falling out with half the Women's Guild, and a scandal involving the solicitor's clerk. Her return had gone unnoticed because no one expected her back, and because she had come under the name Mrs. Margaret Ellis. A few hours later, Miss Marple sat at the vicarage for tea with the Reverend Littleshaw. The clink of teaspoons and the faint sound of the grandfather clock filled the room, but her attention remained sharp. I do believe, she said gently, that someone attended the garden party who wasn't on the guest list. Oh, the vicar replied, pouring a careful stream of milk into his cup. Mrs. Ellis, she said, though her name was Smedley before. You may remember her. The vicar paused. Ruth Smedley. My word, yes. I hadn't realized she'd returned. She was, well, a difficult woman. Had a falling out with Celeste, didn't she? I do believe so, Miss Marple murmured. That same day, Inspector Craddock tracked down Mrs. Ellis, who had indeed been staying with her sister 2 lanes over. She admitted grudgingly that she had attended the garden party without an invitation, just to have a look. Her story was that she'd stayed for 20 minutes, watched from near the garden edge, and then left. But why not announce yourself? Craddock asked. Ruth gave a stiff shrug. No one wanted me back in the first place, and I didn't need their judgment. Miss Marple believed her on one count. Ruth Smedley did not like being overlooked. If she had returned to the village, it was not out of nostalgia. It was for something unfinished. And yet, Miss Marple had a hunch. Ruth Smedley was not the killer. She might have loathed Celeste Daubry, might even have fantasized about doing her harm, but she was not subtle. She didn't wear masks, and this murder had been the work of someone very good at wearing one. It wasn't until Miss Marple returned home that something clicked. As she prepared to place her gloves back in the drawer of her hall table, she noticed a small mark on the inside of one, the faintest trace of powder. Her brow furrowed. She hadn't worn powder, not that day. And then she remembered. She had bumped ever so gently into someone as she'd left the party. A quick movement, a gloved hand brushing against another. It hadn't seemed meaningful at the time, but it had left a scent. She retrieved the glove and brought it to her nose. It was faded now, but she could still detect it. Mimosa Dot, and the person she had brushed past was Daisy Fullerton. It made no sense at first. The vicar's niece, barely 18, quiet, bookish, and unremarkable. But then again, those were the best disguises. Miss Marple returned to her notebook. She flipped back to her first page, the notes she'd jotted the night of the murder. The suspects, their motives, and something she'd written beneath Daisy's name, too innocent, or playing at it. That evening, she took a slow walk past the vicarage. The windows were lit with warm glow. Inside, Daisy sat alone in the drawing room, staring at a cup of untouched tea. Miss Marple watched from the shadows. A girl that age didn't often wear perfume, certainly not one from 1938. And yet the scent had lingered on her gloves. Was it hers, or had she come into contact with it? Miss Marple remembered Daisy's odd phrasing that day. I think she's dead. Not she's dead. And that strange stillness in her face, not quite fear, not quite shock. Something else. She would need to speak to the girl soon. But not yet. The hidden clue had been there all along. Not in the letters, not in the gossip, not even in the guest list, but in the perfume that wasn't hers. And Miss Marple now understood. Whoever killed Celeste had touched her closely, personally. And gloves, Miss Marple knew from experience, were far better at hiding sins than fingerprints. Chapter 6. Confrontations and secrets. Woodley Common had entered the uneasy phase of tragedy. That comes just after morning, But just before understanding, the flowers left at the hedge where Celeste Daubry's body had been found had started to wilt, their petals curling inward like secrets kept too long. The whispers around the village grew quieter, not because people stopped caring, but because something colder had replaced idle curiosity. Fear that the murderer might still be among them. Fear that they might be sitting across from them at lunch. Fear that someone they trusted might not be what they seemed. Inside the vicarage, Daisy Fullerton sat curled in the drawing room with a book she wasn't reading. Her eyes skimmed the same page over and over again. She hadn't slept much. Her appetite had vanished. She had tried, twice, to speak to her uncle, the Reverend Littleshaw, about the day of the party, but the words turned to chalk in her mouth. Every time she remembered Celeste's face, pale against the grass, her stomach clenched. Upstairs, in a quiet guest bedroom, Miss Marple waited patiently. The Reverend had invited her for tea earlier, but she had asked instead if she might have a word with Daisy in private. After all, she said, sometimes young girls spoke more easily with old women than with police or priests. And so, there she sat, hands gently folded, eyes soft but unblinking. Daisy entered the room like a shadow, shoulders tense, lips tight. She took the seat across from Miss Marple without a word. There was silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple began, gently, "You know, Daisy, when I was a girl not much older than you, there was a girl in our village who once made the most terrible mistake. She told a lie, a small one, at first, but it grew like ivy up the side of a house, and eventually it covered everything. I don't think she even meant harm, not really. But by the time she wanted to take it back, she couldn't." Daisy didn't respond. Her knuckles turned white around the armrest of the chair. "You told the inspector that you were near the hedge to get some air, that it was crowded." Daisy nodded. "But you weren't looking for air, were you?" Miss Marple said softly. "You were looking for someone, or perhaps following someone." A long silence followed. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't mean to follow her," Daisy said at last, voice brittle. "But I saw her go toward the hedge. She dropped something. I don't think she noticed. I went to give it back." Miss Marple tilted her head. "What did she drop?" Daisy's eyes filled. "A handkerchief. One of those expensive silk ones. I picked it up. I was just going to call out to her. But then," her breath caught, "but then she was on the ground," Daisy whispered, "like she'd just fallen. I thought maybe she'd fainted. So I ran to her. I touched her shoulder. I tried to shake her." "You wore gloves?" Miss Marple asked gently. Daisy nodded. "And the perfume?" "She smelled different," Daisy said. "Not like before. It was sweet, too sweet. I didn't know what it was, but it got on my gloves." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you say all this to the police?" Daisy looked away. Because they'd think I'd done it. Or that I saw something and didn't help. I didn't want to be in the papers. I didn't want people to look at me." Miss Marple reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. "Daisy," she said kindly, "sometimes the best thing we can do is tell the truth, even if it's late in coming. It doesn't erase what happened, but it frees you from the weight of hiding it." After Daisy left, Miss Marple stood alone in the quiet room, feeling a chill she couldn't quite explain. Daisy had told the truth, or at least part of it. She had been there. She had seen Celeste moments before she was found. But there was something missing still. Something unsaid. Down the road, Cryptic was knocking on doors again. The scent clue had changed everything. Now he wasn't just looking for opportunity, he was looking for motive paired with mimicry. Someone who could become someone else. Someone who could wear another scent, another face, and no one would question it. One particular thread kept tugging at his attention. Celeste had recently sent a letter to the county solicitor asking for legal advice on a potential inheritance dispute. That letter had been discovered among her things, half burned in the fireplace. What dispute? What inheritance? Miss Marple had a theory, and to test it, she visited someone she hadn't yet spoken to, Celeste's landlady, Mrs. Hopper. Mrs. Hopper was a pinched-nosed woman with a mouth that never quite smiled. She had disliked Celeste politely, of course, but disliked her all the same. She brought trouble. She sniffed, the kind of woman who always thinks the room isn't quite bright enough, no matter how many lights you turn on. Miss Marple, over tea, asked about visitors. She had plenty. Mrs. Hopper said, men, mostly. But there was one woman. Came twice. Face half covered with a scarf. Claimed to be her cousin. Didn't give her name. Did she smell of mimosa? Miss Marple asked casually. Mrs. Hopper blinked. That's a funny thing to ask. But yes, I remember because it reminded me of my grandmother. Miss Marple left soon after, her heart beating faster than it had in years. There was another woman. Not Ruth, not Daisy. Someone Celeste had known and kept hidden. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat down and wrote two names side by side on a slip of paper. Celeste Daubry, Elena Dubray, and suddenly, she remembered something else, an article in a magazine, 2 years prior about a French cabaret dancer who had disappeared after being accused of impersonating an heiress. Her name, Elena Dubray. Miss Marple looked at the names again. Not sisters. Not cousins. Doubles. Celeste hadn't just fled something. She had taken someone's identity, and someone had come to take it back. Chapter 7. Another twist train fell over Woodla Common with a cold, deliberate rhythm, softening the edges of the world and deepening the shadows under every tree. Villagers moved about in slickers and galoshes, their chatter quieter now, muffled beneath the umbrellas. The murder of Celeste Daubry had disturbed the still water of their routines, but what came next would shatter it entirely. It was just past 8 o'clock when the scream tore through the village again. This time it came from the bookshop lane, near the back alley that led to the post office. A boy delivering papers had stumbled across something in the shadows. A man collapsed beside the stack of crates behind the old bookseller's back door. His body slumped sideways, his head bleeding from a deep gash at the temple. The boy had run, screaming until someone heard. By the time Constable Delworst arrived, breathless and half-drenched, the man had not moved. It was Edmund Lee, but he wasn't dead. Barely conscious, groaning as the constable leaned down. A trail of blood marked where he'd dragged himself toward the light, his fingers clawing at the cobbles. There were scratch marks on his arms. One of his pockets had been torn. Assault, Cryptic muttered 10 minutes later, standing under the bookshop awning as the medic loaded Edmund into the ambulance. Looks like someone was trying to shut him up, or rob him, or both. Miss Marple arrived just as the van pulled away, her blue raincoat buttoned neatly up to her chin. Cryptic turned to her immediately. Did you hear? I did, she said calmly, though I rather suspect it's not what it seems. Someone tried to kill him, Miss Marple, or frighten him. Not all violence is intended to silence. Sometimes it's to provoke. Cryptic gave her a look. Provoke what, exactly? A memory, she said softly, or a confession. The villagers, now thoroughly spooked, responded the only way they knew how, by retreating further into silence or doubling down on rumor. In the span of a day, a theory had bloomed that Edmund Lee was the killer after all, and that someone was taking justice into their own hands. Others claimed that Celeste had been part of a criminal ring and Edmund was her handler. A few suggested an affair gone wrong. The truth was harder to swallow. No one really knew what was happening anymore. But Miss Marple knew something had changed. That night, she sat by the fire in her sitting room, knitting needles moving slowly as she went back over everything. Celeste's real name, Elena Dubray, her sudden rival in the village, her attempt to claim an inheritance under a false identity, her visits from a mysterious woman who wore mimosa perfume. And now Edmund, assaulted and perhaps followed. A thought tugged at her mind. If Celeste had taken someone's identity, had the real Eleanor returned? Or had someone else come to silence both the impersonator and the witness? She pulled her notebook back out and returned to the page marked Unknown Woman Mimosa. Underneath it, she wrote, "Doesn't want the past exposed. Strong enough to kill. Not Ruth, not Daisy. Then who?" She paused, then added, "Or is Daisy protecting someone else?" The next morning, Cryptic received news that shifted everything again. In Celeste's belongings, specifically a locked drawer in her vanity, an envelope had been found, wrapped in silk, sealed with wax. Inside was a collection of documents in French, letters, a birth certificate, and a deed to a modest property in Marseille. All in the name Elena Dubré. But here was the twist. The photo attached to the identity card was not Celeste. It was someone else. "You're telling me Celeste wasn't Elena?" Cryptic asked the officer. "No, sir. At least not the original one." Miss Marple, when shown the image, stared at it for a long moment. The woman was younger than Celeste, thinner, with darker eyes, but the resemblance was uncanny, like a cousin, or a sister, or a double. Cryptic cursed under his breath. So she impersonated someone she looked like, lived as her. But why? For the inheritance? Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I think Celeste was the decoy. Someone used her to lay claim to something, but the real Elena never left." Cryptic frowned. "Then where is the real one?" And then Miss Marple said something that chilled him. "She might be closer than you think." That evening, just as the village settled again under the dull weight of fog and whispers, a knock echoed at the door of Miss Marple's cottage. It was Daisy. Tear-streaked, alone, shaking. I need to talk to you," she said. Miss Marple stepped aside without a word and let her in. The girl sat by the fire, wringing her hands, her eyes darting as if being followed. "I lied," she said. Miss Marple didn't interrupt. "I said I found her like that. But I didn't. I saw someone with her, just for a moment, behind the hedge. I didn't recognize her at first." "Her?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Daisy nodded. "She wore a scarf, big sunglasses, but I know who it was now. I saw her again yesterday." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was my mother." Miss Marple froze. Daisy's mother had died in a train accident 7 years ago, or so the story had gone. But now, a new truth began to rise from the fog, one that had been buried in lies, one that might explain everything. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Following morning, Woodley Common was blanketed in a heavy fog, the kind that dulled sound and blurred edges, as if the village itself wished to hide from the truth that had begun to stir. Inside her sitting room, Miss Marple sat with her lace shawl draped neatly around her shoulders, a teacup steaming gently beside her. But she was not knitting. Not this time. Instead, she stared into the embers of the fire, lost in thought, as her mind moved through the details like fingers over a worn tapestry, every thread, every knot, every quiet flaw revealing a picture now nearly complete. Daisy's confession had shattered the final illusion. Her mother, supposedly dead, had been seen alive. It wasn't a lie, not a fantasy. Miss Marple had no doubt the girl was telling the truth. The trauma in her voice, the trembling in her hands, it wasn't something that could be faked. And yet the implications were staggering. A dead woman walking among the living, a girl forced to hold a truth too terrible for her age, a village about to learn what happens when the past refuses to stay. Buried, the woman Daisy saw behind the hedge was indeed the same mysterious guest who visited. Celeste Elena Dubré, the real one. She had returned not to reclaim her identity, but to punish the woman who had stolen it and the one who helped make that theft possible, which led Miss Marple to her final test, not of evidence, but of character, because this murderer was not someone who could be caught with fingerprints or letters. She was someone who believed she had outwitted everyone, someone who had lived a second life, quietly, patiently, hidden behind layers of grief and lies. Someone who had worn grief like a veil, someone everyone believed dead. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited 3 people to tea: Reverend Littleshaw, Daisy Fullerton, and Mrs. Margaret Ellis, formerly Ruth Smedley, but now exposed as someone much more dangerous. The table was set perfectly silver-polished, scones warm, jam placed just so. Daisy sat silently, her face pale. The vicar, clearly confused by the gathering, tried to offer polite conversation. Mrs. Ellis, ever watchful, sat with her gloved hands neatly folded, her smile tight and unmoved. Miss Marple poured tea with a gentle grace, speaking softly. "I've always found that tea brings out the truth in people," she said, "much more than police interviews or courtrooms. It's difficult to lie with a teacup in your hand." Mrs. Ellis's eyebrow arched, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "I was thinking, just this morning, about perfume. How scent is memory. How even decades later, a certain fragrance can pull you back to a single moment. Mimosa, for instance. It was popular in 1938. I remember my cousin wore it. She said it made her feel young again, though she was only 30. Mrs. Ellis took a sip of tea. Her expression didn't shift. Miss Marple went on, her voice soft as ever. "It's funny, isn't it? How scent can betray us. Just like names. We think we can change them, bury the old ones, become someone new. But the past is stubborn." At that, Mrs. Ellis looked up just for a moment. A flicker, not fear, annoyance. Daisy, across from her, stared. "You told me she died," Daisy said suddenly. Her voice cracked. "You said she died in the fire." Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "She didn't die," she said. "She disappeared and took a different name, but not before helping a certain young woman, Celeste Daubry, forge an identity that wasn't hers." Reverend Littleshaw blinked. "I don't understand." Miss Marple nodded. "You wouldn't, because it wasn't your past to know. But this woman," she looked straight at Mrs. Ellis, "has never truly left. She's been watching, waiting, and when Celeste came back to the village with that name, that face, and a plan to collect an inheritance she didn't deserve, someone snapped." Mrs. Ellis placed her teacup down. "Such imagination, Miss Marple," she said coldly. "If I were the murderer, why come to the party at all?" "To see it happen," Miss Marple said gently, "to make sure it was done right." A silence fell over the room like a closing curtain. Then Mrs. Ellis laughed, a small, brittle sound, not quite human. "You think I killed her because she took something from me?" she asked. "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think you killed her because she reminded you of what you had given away willingly, and then regretted." Mrs. Ellis stood. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No, but I have Daisy." At that, Daisy pulled something from her pocket, a folded silk handkerchief. "One of Celeste's. I saw you take it," Daisy whispered. "I saw you wipe your hands. I was going to tell. That's why you followed me later. That's why Edmund tried to stop you. You hurt him." Mrs. Ellis went still. Craddock stepped out from the next room, where he had been listening. "You are under arrest," he said. She didn't fight. As they led her out, she turned back to Miss Marple. She deserved worse. Miss Marple said nothing. She never did in that final moment, because by then, the truth was enough. Chapter 9. The reveal. Rain had ceased by morning, but a low fog still blanketed Woodla Common like an old memory. The village, though physically unchanged, carried a subtle weight. Doors opened more cautiously. Conversation started slower. The mystery that had hovered like a ghost for days was beginning to take shape, and the villagers sensed it. They didn't know the ending, not yet, but they could feel it drawing near. Miss Marple, as ever, was already 3 steps ahead, inside her cottage. She sat in her reading chair, the fire crackling quietly beside her. On the small side table rested her well-used notebook, now nearly filled with the looping script of her deductions. She had rewritten the names more than once, rearranged timelines, even questioned her own instincts. But now it was clear. All threads had led here to a story of identity, deception, and an old, unburied sin across the village. At the small county police station, Chief Inspector Cryptic stood over a table covered in files. Photographs, receipts, perfume sales, a partial thumbprint, and most damning of all, a pair of gloves found in a hedge, dusted lightly with mimosa residue and bearing a faint trace of Celeste Daubry's foundation. And at the center of it all, Ruth Smedley, once thought dead, now living as Mrs. Margaret Ellis. She had returned not to reconnect with her past, but to protect it, to preserve the carefully constructed lie that had become her second life. But when Celeste reappeared, bearing her real name and laying claim to something more than money, claiming the entire story of another woman's life, Ruth had cracked dot, and in that moment, she hadn't simply committed murder. She had tried to erase a witness to her own vanishing. The scene at the vicarage was quiet. Daisy sat in the drawing room, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on the corner of the rug as if hoping it would open and swallow her up. The fire burned low. Miss Marple sat opposite her, not with the air of an interrogator, but of a grandmother preparing to bandage a child's skinned knee. "You did a brave thing, Daisy," she said softly. "Telling the truth, even when it's painful. That's more than most adults are capable of." Daisy's lip trembled. "She looked just like I remembered," she whispered. "But her eyes, they weren't the same." "No," Miss Marple said, "because she wasn't the same. Grief changes a woman. So does guilt." A knock came at the door. The Reverend entered, looking tired. Behind him, Cryptic stood silently. He gave a small nod to Miss Marple. "It's time," he said. They found Ruth Smedley in her borrowed room, quietly folding linen into a small suitcase. When she saw them, she didn't startle, didn't run. She only looked at Cryptic, then at Miss Marple. "I knew you'd come," she said. Cryptic stepped forward. "Mrs. Ellis, that name's dead," she interrupted. "Like the rest of it. You're under arrest for the murder of Celeste Daubry," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I didn't mean to," Ruth said softly, her hands tightening on the fabric. "But she wasn't going to stop. I gave her everything once, helped her, hid her, and she came back and took it all again. Even my name, even my daughter." There was a long silence. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You didn't lose your daughter, Ruth," she said gently. "You walked away from her. There's a difference." Ruth's eyes filled not with tears, but with something heavier, shame. "She wouldn't have understood," she whispered. "I couldn't explain everything. I thought if I disappeared, she could start fresh. Be happy. She grew up thinking you were dead," Miss Marple said. "She spent years grieving, and then she saw you, standing over a dead woman, and had to decide whether to speak or protect you." Ruth's voice cracked. "I never wanted to be that kind of mother. You became that kind," Miss Marple said softly. "But you don't have to remain her." Cryptic stepped forward. Ruth didn't resist. As they led her out, Daisy stood silently at the top of the staircase, watching. Their eyes met. Ruth paused, her mouth parting as if to speak, but she said nothing. No apology, no explanation. Just a mother and daughter, broken apart by lies too long protected. Later that day, Cryptic and Miss Marple sat together in the library of the vicarage, reviewing everything that had come to light. She helped Celeste years ago, during some legal fraud in Marseille, Cryptic said. Faked identities, inheritance manipulation. But when the heat got too close, Ruth vanished, burned her clothes, left her wedding ring on a train track, reinvented herself as a widow, moved to the north. For 8 years, she was a ghost. And then Celeste returned, Miss Marple added. with the documents, the name, ready to lay claim to the Dubre property. Ruth knew if she succeeded, the trail would lead straight to her, so she confronted her. Cryptic said, and when Celeste wouldn't back down, Ruth panicked. Miss Marple finished. She didn't come to the party with the intention to kill, but when Celeste threatened exposure, she struck, used the scarf, quick, silent, and then stepped back into the crowd. And what of Daisy? Cryptic asked. She'll need time, Miss Marple said. Truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just stops the bleeding. They sat in silence. Then Cryptic turned. And how did you know? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ruth wore mimosa. No one else in the village would have. That perfume vanished from shelves decades ago. But some sense stay with you that evening. As the sun finally burned through the fog and spilled gold across the rooftops, Miss Marple returned home. She set her notebook down, picked up her knitting. Outside, the village began to return to life. Children played. The bakery reopened. And the hedge behind the vicarage grew just a little taller. In the end, Miss Marple wrote one final line in her book. The perfume wasn't hers, but the guilt was. And with that, the case closed. Not with applause, but with quiet. Chapter 10. Aftermath. Morning after Ruth Smedley, known falsely in Woodley Common as Margaret Ellis, was taken into custody, the village woke not to bells or sirens, but to the sound of birds. It was one of those rare English mornings where the mist lifted early, and dew clung like silver to the hedgerows. The church bells remained silent. No bakery deliveries rattled past the cobbled streets. Even the grocer's boy, usually fond of whistling as he zipped from one doorstep to another, moved with uncharacteristic quiet, because something had settled over Woodley Common, something heavier than scandal. Truth. For the first time in years, perhaps in living memory, the people of the village knew something unshakable had occurred, something that could not be ignored, dismissed, or tucked under a lace doily like so many prior village whispers. They had witnessed not just the end of a life, but the unmasking of a second, one, the revelation that someone who walked among them had not been who she claimed to be. That was the more haunting part, not the murder. The light out inside her cottage on Church Lane. Miss Marple sat in her armchair beside the window, a tray of half-eaten toast and marmalade on the table beside her. Her cat, named Solomon, napped quietly on the footstool, the tip of his tail flicking once in a while as though in dream. She wasn't knitting. Nor reading. Instead, she was simply watching. It had always amazed others how she could sit for hours with her hands folded, her gaze soft, her expression neutral, yet be doing more work in that silence than any man in uniform. Her mind, in that stillness, was quietly reorganizing everything she had seen, heard, and understood. The scent of mimosa still lingered in her thoughts, just as it had on the gloves Daisy had worn after touching Celeste's body. It had been such a subtle clue, so small it could have been missed by anyone less trained in the patterns of human nature. But for Miss Marple, it had been everything, because the scent didn't belong to the dead woman. And if there's one thing Miss Marple knew, it was this: people rarely borrow perfume. Perfume is identity. It's intention. You don't wear someone else's scent by accident, unless you're trying to pretend to be them. Or, more dangerously, to unmake them. Ruth Smedley had told Cryptic that she hadn't intended to kill Celeste. Miss Marple believed her. At least, partially. What Ruth had intended was to silence her, to make her disappear. It may have begun as a confrontation, a plan to threaten, to intimidate, but Ruth had waited too long. Let bitterness ferment too deeply. When Celeste wouldn't yield, when she insisted on reclaiming the identity they had once forged together in deceit, Ruth had snapped. She had killed her not only out of fear, but out of jealousy. Not romantic jealousy, existential jealousy. Celeste had lived the life Ruth had thrown away. Ruth had faked her death to escape disgrace. She had left behind a daughter, a community, a name. And when she finally returned, expecting the past to stay buried, she found Celeste not only alive but radiant, beloved, powerful. It was, Miss Marple thought, the ultimate betrayal of a lie. To see someone thrive inside the falsehood you helped create. It made Ruth a murderer, but also a tragic one. And Miss Marple, while never excusing evil, understood tragedy better than most. That afternoon, the village gathered for the first time since the scandal had broken. Not officially, not in any grand ceremony, but slowly, naturally, on benches and shop fronts and inside the vicarage, where Reverend Littleshaw opened his sitting room for tea and quiet reflection. There were no dramatic speeches, only murmurs. She was always a bit too quiet. That Margaret, do you suppose she was planning it for years? Imagine poor Daisy, to learn her mother had been alive all this time. At that name, people's voices lowered further. No one quite knew what to say about Daisy. She had become something of a figure in the village, not a pariah, not a hero, but a witness. And that made her powerful. In small towns, that power is delicate. Too much sympathy, and she'd feel pitied. Too much distance, and she'd feel alone. It was Miss Marple who navigated this social tightrope for her, with the same precision she used in her investigations. That evening, she invited Daisy to tea. They sat by the fire, the evening breeze rustling the curtains gently. I can't stop thinking about it, Daisy admitted. Her voice hushed. The moment I saw her, I thought I was going mad. And then I felt guilty, like I'd betrayed her by telling. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. My dear, she said, you didn't betray your mother. You gave her a chance to be seen, even if what you saw wasn't what you hoped. Daisy blinked. But I told the police. You told the truth, Miss Marple corrected. That's not betrayal. That's courage. You carried the weight of knowing something awful and chose not to carry it alone. Daisy swallowed hard. I miss her, she whispered. Even after everything. Even though I know she lied. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. Of course you do. We always grieve the version of people we once believed in. Daisy didn't cry. Not this time. She just nodded, and for the first time in many nights, sipped her tea with both hands wrapped around the cup. Meanwhile, Chief Inspector Cryptic was filing his final report on the case. He wrote, while the evidence points conclusively to Ruth Smedley as the perpetrator, the deeper cause lies in the frailty of constructed identity. The motive was not financial gain, nor simple vengeance, but fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of consequence. Miss Marple's role in unraveling this case cannot be overstated. Her understanding of social behavior, emotional residue, and character nuance continues to serve as a reminder that not all detectives wear a badge. Privately, he had started to record notes for a lecture he would give at Scotland Yard, titled, Cases That Taught Me to Listen More Closely. The first case in that lecture would be this one. The trial would come months later, and it would be quiet, held in a small room, behind thick wood-paneled walls. Ruth Smedley's barrister would argue diminished capacity. She would plead guilty, not out of heroism, but because Miss Marple's evidence left no cracks. She would never see freedom again, and the village, slowly, would return to what it was. Almost. Miss Marple's final act in the affair came quietly. She took a walk to the churchyard and left a single white rose on the grave of a woman named Elna Dubrey, a headstone erected in silence by the solicitor, who had processed Celeste's false identity, now properly corrected. No one else came. No one else knew, except Miss Marple. She stood for a moment, her hands folded, and said nothing, because some endings don't require words. Some only need to be witnessed. Later that evening, back in her sitting room, she opened her notebook, her true ledger, filled with dozens of solved crimes and quiet truths, and turned to a fresh page. She wrote in careful script, Case closed, the perfume that wasn't hers. Victim, Celeste Daubry, born Elena Dubray. Perpetrator, Ruth Smedley. Known as Margaret Elizabeth. Protection of false identity. Emotional collapse under threat of exposure. Myth, strangulation. Concealed by distraction during public gathering. Key clue. Mimosa perfume. Out of time. Out of character. Out of place. A catalyst. The witness. Daisy Fullerton. Conclusion. Some people kill out of rage, others out of greed. But sometimes, a person kills simply to hold together a life built on lies. The tragedy is not just in the murder but in all the years that led to it. She paused and wrote one final line beneath it. Even lies leave a scent behind. Then she closed the book. Solomon stirred from the footstool. The fire crackled softly. Outside. The stars blinked into place. And inside. A woman who understood human nature better than any judge, any inspector, any law. Rested. Another truth had found its way home. And Miss Marple, quiet, composed, utterly relentless, had, once again, set the village back in balance.